Our assignment for this module is deceptively straightforward. I'm going to ask you to create a unified composition, one that features repetition. Make sure that it's visual repetition, the long arc of the feathers, the dark color of the feathers, the general shape of the feathers is being repeated. It's not the feathers that we care about, it's the visual elements. You're going to also have proximity, the way in which you've grouped or clustered things so that we're going to understand their relationships to one another. And then we're going to have some continuation, where our eye naturally flows from one element to another and then back around so that we stay within the composition. I say deceptively straightforward because this person thinks they did the exact same thing. I think here we have a good example of how sometimes when we're trying to create a unified surface, we wind up with something that's sort of stilted, artificial, and doesn't actually do the unifying that we want. The background, for example, is so flat and generic that it really just sort of feels like these cat forms are pasted on. So even though the variety in the background here is actually complicating the information, it does create a unified sense of space. You can feel the light and the air in that composition. This person thinks they did the same thing with plunking down things in a circle. Incidentally, how can we engage the entirety of the picture plane without just having a circle that has dead corners? That's a big problem when we're trying to achieve some continuation. If it's too tight of a path, then I have dead areas in my corners. The forms here are a good example of repetition of subject matter, little kitties, without it being a repetition of visual information, because the shape is so inconsistent, kind of blobby, but not necessarily precise, that I don't really feel like the shape of the cat is being repeated. There is color repetition, but that color is so contrasting with the background that they feel separate rather than unified. Look at the way in which this person is using some of this same warm color in both the background and the subject matter. Here, really the only kind of repetition we have is the repetition of shape that's in the eyes. But they're problematic because they all lead me out of the composition. This one is freaked out because he just saw a wolf and it's going to eat the kitty. Run, kitties, run! Run, everybody! And then he's like, what? A wolf? Oh no, a wolf! And this guy sees, oh no, we're surrounded! All of the eyes are leading me straight out of the composition, and none of them feel like they really connect up as shapes. The proximity is enough that, yes, I do understand that these are grouped, but they aren't necessarily in relationship with one another. There's a sense of separation between them, whereas here, even with the overlapping, or even when there isn't overlapping, there's still a sense of connection as I am grouping these as a cluster of feathers. Here, I'm very much aware of the fact that there are 4 of them, and that can kind of give you an indication that the gestalt isn't working. I'm reading them individually. Here, I don't bother to count the feathers. The continuation isn't really working, even though they're trying so hard to create a circle, partly because the tails keep leading me out of the path. I realize I'm belaboring this, but part of what we have to do when we're creating visual art is to make sure it actually looks good, instead of just follows a schematic that we think makes sense. Again, this person thinks they did pretty much the exact same thing as this person, but all of us are going to agree that this one winds up being much more unified. This is not a painting, which should be pretty exciting to you, because now that we're moving out of color theory and into composition, you don't have to make a painting anymore. You could use Photoshop, printmaking, fibers art, really anything. But I do want to give you a heads up. With digital applications, photographs, Photoshop, it's a lot easier to get to mediocre, but it's just as hard to get to good. You don't have to worry about whether or not the printer is going to apply the pigments in a smooth, clean, interesting way. But you do have to worry about whether or not you're achieving the goal of the assignment. And I would say this one isn't. They have clearly dropped their headphones on a scanner and then manipulated and layered that image. And so you would think there would be some built-in repetition because they've layered it up a couple of times. But the shapes keep cutting into each other in such a way that I don't really feel a sense of repetition with them. The proximity is undermined by the fact that they inverted the color such that the white blasts out and the black doesn't feel like it's connecting up. And then if there was ever something that was just begging for you to make good use of it in a continuation, it's the chord. But look at the way in which all of her chords are leading me off the canvas. That's not to say that other media can't do a good job. You can have a photograph that has repetition and proximity and continuation. You can achieve it in a drawing as well. We want to have sketches where you're thinking about your composition. If you're creating this in Photoshop or creating photographs, your sketchbook might manifest differently. You might not be drawing it multiple times. You might be editing it in different ways. Also, we want to hit a target. We want to hit that 8x10 size, even if that's not exactly the same aspect ratio that you would have in your photograph. You're going to have to crop it and size it appropriately. You can't call up Vogue and tell them that the really cool advertisement that you've come up with needs the magazine to be 2 inches wider. In this case, it actually helped her to improve the composition because when she had to crop it for size, she was able to take out some distracting details like the gondola and a little bit of the landscape. I would also say that this one works well as continuation, even though it doesn't quite make the loop. The arcs do lead my eye out of the composition, but the higher contrast of the brighter colors down here brings me back, so I still circle around.